All right, hello everybody. This is Rick Wilson with Martin Associates. Looks like we have people filtering into the webinar. So let me go through a couple of things here, and I'll go ahead and present the presenter, and we'll get started here. So again, this is Rick Wilson with Martin Associates. Thanks for taking time out of your afternoon today. Hopefully 2021 was a good year for you. You're enjoying the holiday season. So we're excited to welcome you to the presentation for Sage 100 year-end processing. So I think it's a great idea to review these processes, each year to make sure nothing is missed and, everything goes smooth for you for year-end. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items here. So the presentation is being recorded, and we'll go ahead and follow up with an email with a link in a day or so, and so you can get that if you need to reference anything. If you have questions, just go ahead and either use the chat or the Q&A, and we're mainly planning to answer those at the end of the webinar. So I think we're ready to get started. So as you can see on the screen there, Joe Gubser from our office is presenting. He's a director with Martin Associates. So I think that's about it, Joe. I'll let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Rick. And I just want to echo what Rick said. Thanks to everybody for attending the webinar today as we start getting towards year-end close here. I'm going to scroll into the next page here. And so this is an agenda of what I'm going to cover in today's class. So we're going to cover the order of closing and kind of discuss what modules you should close in which order. We're going to talk about some period end / year end processing notes. We will look at the steps for closing the specific modules that I kind of list below there. Will be the ones that we'll concentrate on in this webinar today. We'll talk about the online help a little bit, and then we'll end with the question and answer session at the end, which will be, as Rick said, submit your questions online, and we'll kind of get those answered for you. So moving on, in what order should modules be closed? So this is an important thing, and what this kind of comes down to is modules that are going to send data to and or receive data from other modules as part of the closing process. So you need to close your modules in a particular order to make sure that data flows into the modules as needed before you close that module, and so on and so forth down the line. So when you're performing your period end or year end, you want to close any module that transfers data to other modules. Okay. And then this is kind of the recommended order for closing the modules that Sage has out there. So you'll see it goes from work, bill of material, and work orders kind of out there, and then barcode, then PO, then SO, inventory, through MRP, payroll, AR, AP, job cost, general ledger. And you'll notice the first three I have highlighted like with a little gray background to them. And that's because those three modules don't really have a period end / year end process that you run. Like there's not a menu option to close those modules. For those modules, the year end or the period end process is just make sure you have all the work for that month you're closing or for the year you're closing completed in that module first. Okay. And then looking down this list, you'll notice that sales order and purchase order get closed before inventory because data from those two modules flow into inventory. Same thing where like accounts receivable and accounts payable get closed before general ledger because before job cost via that because it sends data into there, and then the general ledger module is always going to be last because that everything kind of funnels down into that module in terms of journal entries and whatnot. So that's kind of the recommended order of closing. Next, let's talk about some period end / year end processing notes. So some of this stuff I'm talking about is more, it's kind of period end as well, because it's kind of the same concept when you close each month as when you close your actual year. Okay, so that's why I kind of point out both of them here. So an important note right here at the beginning, always make sure that you have a full backup of your Sage 100 system before you do any period end or year end processing. And that's very important because after you close a period or a year, there is no reverse option to say, okay, let's reopen that period or reopen that year, with the exception of one module that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So always make sure you back up your Sage 100 system prior to doing your closing. And then next, for each module, the period end and year end processing options are both run from a period end processing menu. And then on the period end processing menu, there is a menu option called period end processing. Okay. And the system is smart enough to know whether to run period end close or year end close based on what the current period value is for that module in that module setup options. So if you're in periods 1 through 11, it knows to run the period end processing functions. If you're in period 12, the last period of the year, it knows to do the year end processing. Okay. And then the actual period ending dates for your periods and your years are determined underneath of the general ledger module setup menu fiscal year maintenance option. And that's where you define your fiscal or your calendar years. Another important note on the second to last bullet there, make sure to pay attention to the different, and I put in quotes there, number of years to retain history options underneath of the various module setup options, because that's very important. You don't want to have because by default, a lot of those will default to 2 years of maintaining history. And then what happens is when you close that second year and the third year now opens up, it'll start purging off that first year because it only has 2 years of history. So just be very careful that you don't want to have those period history save options set too low, and then you close a year and you don't realize it right away until you're days, weeks down the road, and you realize, oh, I lost all that history because of the way we had our setup options. And there's really no way of saying, let's recreate that history. You could at that point change your years to maintain a greater number of years, but the history that's already been purged will be gone. Okay. I always recommend clients, and whenever I'm usually setting up a system, I'll push that to a really high number, a lot of times to the max that it'll allow. And then we can then reanalyze as we get a lot of history built up out there to say, okay, do we really need X number of years? Can we pare that down to 5 or to 7? And then we can change the option at that point. In the current period and year for each module is found underneath that module setup options. I think I mentioned that a minute ago. Okay, so let's talk about the general ledger module here for a minute. So, the following options or the following things will occur during the period end and year end processing for the general ledger module. So the first thing, any account that has a status of deleted will be removed from the system during year end processing if that account has no activity and no history out there. Okay. And that's based on the transaction history options out in the GL options. Any account that you have flagged as a deleted account that has no activity and no history will get removed. Any account that is flagged as deleted and there's history out there because we're maintaining, let's say, 7 years of history, and we used that account 5 years ago, that account will stay with the status of deleted until enough history gets purged out of the system to where that account no longer has any history. Then it gets rid of that account. But an account that is flagged as deleted will not let you post to it. So it has that safeguard built into it. The second bullet here is really important if you're doing budgets in the system. There is a checkbox that says copy actual to default budget at year end in the general ledger options. Be very careful with that checkbox, because what that checkbox will do is if you have that checkbox checked, and when you close the year, then the actual numbers the actual history from what you're closing will get copied into the next year's default budget as budgeted numbers. Okay. And I've had clients before that have had that checked, and then they'll call me and say, you know, we had our budget in the system for, let's say, 2022, right? And we're closing 2021. All of a sudden, the budget numbers don't make sense. Well, it's because they recently closed 2021. The data from 2021 got copied into the 2022 budget and overwrote their 2022 budget. So be very careful with that. I usually make sure clients have it unchecked as part of the setup. And there's options out in the setup options for resetting journal numbers, where you can say reset journal or register numbers at period end, at year end, or never. And then depending on how you have that set, it'll reset those numbers. If you're using non-financial accounts in the system to track things like employee head count or whatnot, then there's a checkbox on each of those accounts that says about, you know, clear balances checkbox for that account. And if you check that box, then at year-end close, that balance of that account gets reset to zero when you start the next year for that account. And almost treats it like a P&L account, okay, where it resets at the beginning of each year. If you do not check that box, then the ending balance from the year that you're closing will carry over to the beginning balance for the next year for that account. And it's similar to like a balance sheet type account. Okay, so that's for your non-financial accounts. And then any transaction history that is beyond the number of years to maintain is removed. And we kind of mentioned that before. So it'll purge that out as part of the close. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was one module in which you could reopen a year or a period after it's been closed, and that is the general ledger module. Okay, so this module you can reopen. And when reopening a closed general ledger year, it's only possible if you're retaining the detailed history for the prior fiscal year that you're wanting to reopen. If you have your system set where you're not maintaining that history, then you can't reopen it because that history is now gone. The way you reopen a GL period or year is by going into the general ledger options and changing the current fiscal year and current period fields. So let's say that, you know, we don't have our year-end adjusting journal entries from our accountant yet, but we don't want to leave our year open for 2021 as we roll into 2022, because we don't want people to accidentally post to 2021, let's say. So we could go ahead and close 2021, the year. That would then change the current period to 1, and it would change the current year to 2022. Okay, and then whether it's in January, February, or March, or whatever, and we finally get our adjusting journal entries, we would go back into the GL options. We would change our current period to 12, our current year to 2021. That reopens that year. We then can make our adjusting journal entries, post them, and then there's a very important step. You have to make sure you reclose the year for the year that you reopen. And the reason you have to do that is because part of the year-end processing for GL is it closes out or zeroes out any income expense accounts to retain earnings, and it moves the ending balance for any balance sheet accounts over to the beginning balance for the next year. And if you don't reclose that year, then that functionality won't happen. So if you adjusted a balance sheet account after you reopen the year and you didn't reclose, then the ending balance for 2021 for the account that you affected will be different than the beginning balance for 2022 for that account because of that. Okay, that's only if you're reopening a year. If you're only reopening a period, because let's say that we're now in period 5 of 2022, and we realize we forgot to make a journal entry for period 4 or period 3, and we want to make that now, we could just, all you would be doing at that point is changing the current period to the period you want to make the entries for, and you make the entries, post them, and there is no, you don't have to go through the close process again because you're within inside that same year. You just manually go back into GL options and move the period back to the period that it was. Okay, so that's very important when you're doing reopening a general ledger period or year, especially the year. So if you're doing allocations, you need to make sure that if you have any year-end allocations, that you run them prior to doing your year-end close. And allocations are where, give you an example, your telephone bill gets broken down across, let's say, 5 different accounts based on certain criteria. But we want to speed up the data entry of that bill when it comes in each month. So we post it all to one GL account, just called telephone expense general. Okay, and then we create an allocation in the back end side where we say allocate that amount from that expense to these other 5 telephone expenses based on this criteria. That's an allocation. So you want to make sure you run those prior to closing your year. Allocations can be either manual or automatic. And if it's a manual allocation, you do that, you run those through general journal entry and you tell them when they're run. If they're automatic allocations, you run it from the appropriate options on the period end menu. There's some options out there about running your allocations, and that will run all the automatic allocations for you. All right. So that's kind of what I wanted to point out about the general ledger module. Let's talk about the accounts payable module. So, during year end or period end processing for the accounts payable module, the following things will happen. If you flagged a vendor with a status of a temporary vendor, so any temporary vendor that has 0 balances will be purged from the system, unless on the vendor, in vendor maintenance, you check the checkbox to retain the temporary vendor. Okay, so you can tell some temporary vendors to stay out there by checking that box. But any vendor that has a status of temporary, they have no open invoices, it'll basically purge them out of the system as part of the close. Any check history information is cleared as of the period ending. Your vendor electronic payment history is removed based on the number of years you said to retain electronic payment history out in the options. So that's one of those years to retain options that I was talking about before. Same thing, a vendor purchase history is removed based on the number of years you said to retain that out in the accounts payable options. Any open invoices that have a 0 balance will be removed from the system based on the number of days to retain paid invoices. Okay, so there's an option out there that says number of days to retain paid invoices, and that'll get purged based on what you put into that field. If you're retaining invoice history, then all your current year invoice information will get updated to the last year fields. And then any invoice history with no current year activity is removed based on how you have your options set up out there. Again, based on those number of year features out there. All right, so more on accounts payable module here. When you're closing the AP module and you're trying to balance to your accounts payable general ledger account or accounts, you would run the report off of the AP reports menu called the accounts payable trial balance report. That's the report you want to use to balance to your general ledger, not the accounts payable aged invoice report. Okay, and the reason being is this: the trial balance report will base the data that it has on it off of the posting date of the individual transactions. And that's also, the posting date is when it hits the general ledger. So they should match up. The aged invoice report bases its information off of the invoice date that you entered during invoice data entry. Okay, so these reports can get out of balance if, for example, you have a transaction that you have an invoice date in 1 month, but you post it in another month. So let's an example here. We have an invoice that is dated November 30th, okay, and we just posted it today. We just put it into the system today on December 15th, okay? So we put an invoice date of 11/30 on it. But when we ran the invoice register, we said post it to today's date, December 15th. That's when it hits the general ledger. So if we ran an aged invoice report as of the end of November, that transaction will show up on it because of the invoice date of November 30th. If we ran the trial balance report as of November, that would not show up on it because we posted it in December 15th. And it also would not show up in the balance in general ledger until December as well because of the posting date. So very important there when you're trying to tie out. So accounts payable module 1099s. So the printing of your vendor 1099s is actually independent of the closing of the accounts payable module. Okay. The system tracks a separate 1099 calendar year, which is separate from the general ledger fiscal year, because you might not be a 12/31 end, but 1099s always go off 12/31. So so that's an independent thing, but it's still part of your year-end processing when you're at the end of December getting those out. And you can use Atrix, which is a program that kind of comes with Sage that you can install to print and or electronically file your 1099s from within inside of Sage 100. Okay. The accounts receivable module. So a lot of the things you're going to see in the accounts receivable module here are very similar to things that we saw in the accounts payable module, because those modules kind of mirror each other in a lot of ways. So here's what happens during the period end and year-end processing for accounts receivable. Just like temporary vendors get purged out, temporary customers with zero balances are automatically purged out unless we select to retain temporary customers with paid invoices out in the AR options. That's a little different in AP, where the vendor was flagged on each vendor whether to retain them. This is an overall thing of whether to retain temporary vendors based on one option. And then you have a bunch of purges that'll happen. So monthly cash receipts history is purged based on the years to retain cash receipts history. Sales history is purged based on years to retain customer history. Salesperson history is purged based on the years to retain salesperson history. So all history options out there that are set up how long to maintain data, and it'll purge accordingly. And then just like in AP, any open invoice with a zero balance will get removed during the period end and or year end based on the days to retain paid invoices out in the AR options. Another thing, this is this screen of the accounts receivable module, or this screen of the slide here is basically the same as what I showed you out in the accounts payable module. And it basically just goes over when you're trying to tie out your accounts receivable GL accounts to your sub AR module, you should run the accounts receivable trial balance report, not the aged invoice report. And again, it's because the trial balance report, just like the posting to the general ledger, goes off the transaction date, where the aged invoice report goes off the invoice date. Okay, so that's the same for the AP module. So let's look at the distribution modules here a little bit. So the big thing about the inventory management module that you want to kind of pay attention to is what are called negative tiers. Okay, and what are negative tiers? So basically, negative tiers are where you have an item that is either LIFO or FIFO, and you sold more items than what the system thinks were on, than what the system says were on hand. So you go into a negative costing tier out there. Okay. All right. So typically a negative tier will happen where somebody puts items out on the shelf and they get shipped out before somebody does a receipt of goods on those items. So that new FIFO layer or LIFO layer didn't get created out there. So what happens is it'll keep selling out of the last, let's take FIFO for instance, out of the last FIFO layer that's out there, it'll keep selling out of that FIFO layer and it'll go to negative numbers. And the cost of that item will be at whatever cost was assigned to that FIFO layer. Well, when you now do your receipt of goods and it creates that new FIFO layer, that's going to have the total amount of what you received in. So you run this negative tier adjustment, and what that will do is that'll take any positive FIFO layers and offset them against any negative FIFO tiers out there to get rid of those negative tiers. And there might be an adjustment to the inventory adjustment account if the unit costs between the two layers were different. So if you were selling out of the negative tier at $35 and the new one came in at $35.10, there will be a 10-cent adjustment out there to the cost when you do that negative tier for every item sold, when you do that adjustment to fix those. Okay, so that's what negative tiers are, and that's how you kind of clear them up. The sales order module. So here's the things that will occur during the period end or year end of the sales order module. So the sales order recap will get purged based on the purge sales order recap at period end options and how long you said to maintain history out there. Sales history is purged based on the number of years to retain sales history options out in accounts receivable. That only happens at year end, where the recap above happens during period end or year end. And then in sales order, you can create what are called master orders or repeating orders. And a master order is when one big order is set up out there, and you're going to then create individual sales orders off of that. Like there's almost like a contract, and somebody agrees to buy X from you, and you set that up as a master order, and then individual orders are placed against that master order or that contract when individual things are, when they say ship us these parts. And repeating order is when you want to be able to create a sales order from a template almost, where you set up this repeating order because it's something that gets placed a lot by a customer and you can copy from that template. Well, both those master orders and those repeating orders have expiration dates on them. And any order that's a master order or a repeating order that has an expiration date that has already happened, when you do a period end or a year end processing, it will purge them out if they're quote unquote expired. Okay. Purchase order module. Here's what happens during the close of the purchase order module. Any purchase order that is completed will be purged from the system based on the days to retain completed purchase orders. Now, this option isn't as critical as it used to be, or you don't have to be where you maintain as much history out here to keep these completed orders out in your purchase order entry system now, because within the past few versions of Sage, they added a purchase order history option out there, kind of like what the sales order has for sales order history. There's a purchase order history option. And even when an order gets purged out of purchase order entry, it'll still reside out in that purchase order history option. And you can still look at those orders out there. That used to not be the case. So a lot of times you would set that days to retain completed POs to as high as it could go, because people would want to go back and look at their history of purchase orders out there. The purchase order recap is automatically purged if the purchase order recap at period end option is selected. Any receipt history is automatically purged if the retain purchase order history option is not selected in purchase order. And then just like we talked about master orders and repeating orders in sales order, there is also the ability to do master orders and repeating orders in the purchase order module. And just like in the sales order module, there is an expiration date on these as well. And in any master or repeating order that has an expiration date that's already passed will be purged from the system as part of the close. Okay, purchase order module. One other thing to talk about for this module is what is called the purchases clearing report. And this is a report that is used to reconcile the purchases clearing account balance in GL with the open amounts from the purchase order module. Okay, so the purchase order clearing account is a liability account that gets posted to when you do a receipt of goods and you don't have the invoice at that time. So what the system will do is it will debit inventory for the amount of the inventory, and it's going to credit this purchases clearing account. It's like a wash account or a holding account. Okay, and then when the invoice does come in and you do a receipt of invoice, it will then, for the lines that you're doing the invoice against, it'll then pull that amount out of the purchase clearing account, and it will now debit that account to wash it out, and it offsets it with the credit to the accounts payable account. Okay, and the account for the purchases clearing account is set up underneath product line maintenance for each product line underneath the inventory management module. Okay, so this account can get out of balance if transactions are not processed properly in the system. And here's some examples of when an out of balance could occur. If you inventory receipts are updated using transaction entry instead of receipt of goods. Okay, so you're not affecting the PO in that regard, but it still hit the PO clearing account. So, but it won't show up on the purchase clearing report. The order quantity or unit cost is changed after performing either receipt of goods or receipt of invoice. You make manual journal entries to the purchases clearing account, something you really should never do unless you're just trying to get the account back in balance. And then from there, you're going to keep it in balance. Or if you receipt of goods register or receipt of invoice register has been updated to an incorrect general ledger period. So that's some examples of how that report can get out of balance. For anybody using the payroll module, the following occurs when you're doing a quarter end close or a quarter end processing. The current quarter set in the payroll options is advanced to the next quarter. The time off accrual values are updated based on the settings for the allow time off accruals from field in payroll options. In addition to the above items, this is what happens when you're doing a year-end processing. The field showing the employee's year-to-date direct deposit amounts get cleared. Any terminated employee records are removed from the file if there's no history associated with them. Some of that kind of has changed a little bit with the new versions of payroll, but pension plan deductions, if the reset balance at year-end checkbox in your deduction code maintenance is selected, then the deduction balance will get reset to the deduct based on the deduction goal amount for the next year. Okay, otherwise it leaves that balance out there. If an employee has no history for a deduction, then that deduction gets removed from the employee record. If calendar year is selected in the reset time off based on field in the payroll options, then any employee's unused time is carried over to the next year, up to the carryover limit that you set up in employee maintenance. Any history records, including time track entry history records, get purged if they're older than the number of years you said to maintain history out in the options. And in the current processing year in payroll options gets moved to the next year. And in the quarter gets set back to quarter one. Okay, so that's some stuff for payroll. Online help. There's some good help out there for the period end processing that you can access if you go out to the online help and then just search on the topics you're looking for. So the example I gave here is general ledger period end processing. Another way to get some good help on each individual module's period end processing steps is when the screen, so when you go to that module's period end menu and you click on period end processing, in the lower right hand side of the screen, there's a little question mark. You can click on that and go down to the option called About This Window, and it takes you out to Sage's online help for that module's period end close in, and it's a good little thing you could read through about what happens during that module's period end close. Okay. So we have a couple minutes left here before I want to get into questions and answers. So what I want to do is I'm going to jump out here to Sage 100 for a minute and just point out a couple of things. So if I go to the general ledger module, and if I go to setup and I go to options, and all the modules will really have this part. This is where I was telling you for each module, you'll know what year and what period you're in by going to the options of that module. And it's typically going to be on the right-hand side of the main tab. A lot of times it's up here to the top right, but it'll be somewhere usually on the right-hand side right here. In General Ledger, this is the one where I said you could reopen years and periods. And the way you do that is just by going 2024, period 12. And then when I said accept right there, that year and period will be open at that point. Okay. And you'll see all these history options out here. So here's your years to retain General Ledger history. And notice that's at 2 because that's what it is by default. And you can go up to 99 years there. So again, I usually have clients put that to a really high number just as a safeguard. And then, like I said, we could always pare that down later. In General Ledger, I talked about this copy actual to default budget at year end. That's where I said, be careful because when you have that checked, then when you close a year, the actual numbers for that year would get moved over to the default budget, which in this case is the original budget for the next year. So be careful with that checkbox right there. And there's other things here like accounts receivable. If we look at that and go to period end, there's always usually a period end menu here. And then somewhere on there will be an option called period end processing right here. All right. And then when you go there, this is the screen I was telling you about. And here's where you could go to the help. And that's going to be very similar on all the modules where this kind of screen will come up showing you what year or period is getting ready to close. But you can click on this help right here and go to about this window. And it'll bring up the online help for AR period end processing. And there's, some related topics you can get here. There's some notes down through here. Talks about the period end reports. So a good way to get right into the help for that module's period end close. But things inside of here, like if I go to my setup options, kind of like what we saw in GL, you'll see things like here's your current year and period. And then there's a history tab here. And this is where it gets into things like years to retain cash receipts history, years to retain customer history, years to retain salesperson history. So be very careful with those years to retain options. Okay. Let's see, inventory. We talked about the negative tiers. So I'm going to go to period end here, and there's this negative tier report here that you run. And you don't have to do this as part of year end. It's just a nice step to do as part of year end or period end. And if I run this, let's see if we have any negative tiers out here for the ABC company. Okay, you'll see we have a couple. So we have these items here that have negative tier quantities. And here's the tier value. All right, so they were over distributed. So we can then run this negative tier adjustment. And this will look and see if there are any positive tiers for those items to apply against those negative tiers. So let me run this. And notice there was only one. So that first item, we had negative quantity of 8 here. We're taking a positive quantity 8 here from this cost tier, and it was the same cost. So notice that went negative at $34.25, and the new value for the new layer was $35.25. So that's why we have no adjustment amount right here. If this would have been like $30 and say 50 cents, then we would have had a $4. No, 50 cents. So it would have been a $2 adjustment amount because it would have been 25 cents per item adjusted. But I'm going to go ahead and apply that to this now. Just show you this real quick. Okay, and if I now run my negative tier report again, that file cabinet should now drop off. See how that file cabinet of -8 is now gone. So that's your negative tier adjustment. Some other thing, we talked about the purchase order module and on the period end menu. we talked about this purchases clearing report. So if I run this is a report where your receipt of goods and your receipt of invoice happen at different times from each other, and it will track that out in this purchases clearing report. Okay, and I'm going to run this. And it will look like this. So it shows me by PO, by item. So the quantity ordered is really just for reference purposes. What drives the item being on this report is if this column here, quantity received, is different than the quantity invoiced. So we received 99 of them, okay, at a cost of $26.75, and we invoiced -1 for at that cost. Here we received 50 of this item from this PO at $26.75. We done a receipt of invoice for 0, so it basically credited $13.37 out there. And then, you know, everything that has a difference will all total up in this total amount right here of $77,557.64 should title our general ledger balance for the PO clearing report, for the PO clearing account. Okay. Let's see. I'm just trying to think of things that are kind of off the just clicking on the period and options. Last thing we'll talk about here, and then we'll jump into the see if there's any questions. Accounts payable reports. There's this form 1099 tax reporting, and this is how you run your 1099s. And this will integrate with Atrix. Now, I want to get a message telling me that the current form out there is 2021, because that's the current year form. There is no 2025 form yet, but that's when this data thinks is sitting out there as. So you're going to see that message come up here in a minute. Just ignore that. And this is the message I was telling you about. It was telling me I'm in 2025, but the current form is 2021. I'm going to go ahead and continue anyway. And then it's going to start asking me these questions. So, you know, I want to say no thanks to that and keep going. Here's my taxpayer ID number. This is just talking about the restarting and whatnot. And I'm going to say no, I'm a single 1099 data file for this EIN number. Here's my taxpayer information number. Okay, go next, and you tell it whether you're filing for your company / employer or you're a third party preparer. And then if you had any states or localities out there, they would show up. Anybody that's getting it electronically, I want to say no, because you could also have the system email them as well. Do I want to truncate any numbers? And I want to say no. And what this is doing now, and it's kind of processing on my screen. I'll drag it over here in a minute, but it is reading through my Sage system, and it is populating the Atrix program with any vendor that has 1099 information out there. So I have one that I set up. It'll show you their information, okay, their address, name, what boxes, and their amounts. Okay, and it's just a next process of stepping through here, validating the data. See how I keep hitting next? And what it's doing is it's validating things. Is there a taxpayer ID number on each person? If there wasn't, it would stop, and that would be highlighted in red, and I'd have to put a taxpayer ID number in. Or put it out in Sage and restart the process. So I'm just nexting through here as it validates everything. So that validates all my data, and it now takes me out to Atrix and how I can run this. And here is where I was talking about how Atrix can do your 1099s for you. So you can either do the complete 1099 e-filing, and it's got next business day mailing, it says. And what that is it'll print and mail your recipient copies out to your vendors. And it's basically the number that you have times $2.45. is how much it costs to do that. Okay. And that's basically the cost. So that's how you can figure, and it'll tell you here what your total cost is going to be. There's a minimum of $24.95. That's why we're paying $24.95. But if we had, say, 20 of those, it'd be, $49 basically, roughly, give or take, 49 and change, or no, 49. All right. And there's other options where you can, not have it print it for you, but just tell it you want it to only print. You don't want to do e-file, or you want to do just the e-filing. Okay. And it'll basically, if you do the complete up here, it files everything for you electronically. And it does everything for you as part of that. Okay. So that's kind of running through 1099s there. Payroll is very similar when you run your W-2s out on the menu. You would run your, you would run your federal and electronic file, federal and state electronic filing, or something like that it's called. And then it'll do the similar stuff what we saw, where you answer some questions up front. It'll read your data out in Sage for W-2s, and it will render the data over to Atrix. You step through the validation like we did, and you'll end up at the same similar screen of this, where it'll ask you if you want to print your W-2s only, do you want to electronically file them, how you want to go about doing that. So very similar process. Okay. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover. And that brings us up to any questions and answers. So I don't know if we have any questions or answers, or any questions out there, Rick.
Let's see. There's one here on the host side. Question about which versions are supported, with any payroll and 1099 updates that usually come out. So yeah, so Sage's policy is they support the current version and 2 versions back is what is the supported version. So right now, the current version of Sage 100 is Sage 100 2021. So that means that they support 2021, 2020, and 2019 for the year-end close. Right. Gotcha. Yeah, and they've been pretty steadfast at that as far as, having updates and. Correct. Yeah. Specifically for payroll and 1099s. If you're not doing any of those 2 things, it's not as critical. Correct. If you're not really dealing with Atrix and all that kind of stuff, and you're just kind of closing your periods, you're not trying to integrate with the Atrix product. Right. That's where most of the updates are. Yeah. Yep. And that came in like, payroll, not payroll, accounts payable last year with the NEC vendor. That was all part of a year-end, like a year-end update. And that can only be put on last year for 2020, 19, or 18, for instance. Right. Yep. There's another one here. And it's the only other one I have, but it's talking about, do you have to close the year to enter transactions for the future year? Okay, you don't have to. And even more so in the newer versions, you don't have to. Older versions of Sage, you could only have like 2 years open and things like that. And it would start these future years and future periods, all that stuff. And you kind of started commingling data. And that's a little more lax in the newer version of Sage 100. But if you don't close, the risk you're running is people accidentally posting transactions to prior periods or years, right? You might have already ran your financial statements and whatever, and you're all set. And then all of a sudden, you can't figure out why they're showing different numbers. Well, because you had 2 years ago still open, somebody, fat fingered a data, a posting date during a register, and now they posted, 2 years in the past. Right. So it's a good policy to kind of keep them closed, especially because everything kind of funnels down to GL, basically, right? And you can always reopen your GL if you need to make adjusting journal entries at any point in time. Right. Yeah. 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 With recent versions where everything's date sensitive, you don't have to, but the purpose is from a policy standpoint to keep from prior posting. Yeah. Yeah. Just keep closing in it, but you don't have to be as necessarily where it's got to be closed on this day, because that's kind of a little more lax, but good policy to have in place so to still close regularly. Right. There's a question here. What is the best way to generate year-end numbers, such as sales and commissions?
Well,
Similar to month-end numbers.
well, for commissions, well, there's history reports out there. There's sales history reports and whatnot. Commissions, there is out in accounts receivable, if you have commissions turned on, it will track all that information out here in this commission maintenance table. And it will look like this. So here's all the data that's tracked out there. And this is all based on how you set up commissions in your options of what it's going to track here and whether it is going to track here. So it's by salesperson, by customer, by invoice. It'll show you the invoice date, the payment date, any invoice total, the amounts paid, any amount subject to commission, what commission amount got calculated, and it's based on these rates. Okay, and that's all coming from a combination of what salesperson is assigned to the invoice, what commission rate is that salesperson getting, what items are on that invoice, and are those items subject to commissions or not. It's all driven by that. Okay, so that data is all tracked out there. Now, commissions are very kind of tricky. Not really tricky. It gets down to everybody has their own kind of way of what they pay commissions off of. So a lot of times with that information, we'll take the data that's out there and write reports based on how they look at the data to create their commission reports for them. Okay, so I mean, that's kind of what I would say about commissions. And then there's history reports out here, like here's salesperson sales by history, here's customer sales history by period. Yeah,
and those have year-end or I guess year-to-date values as well as monthly, I believe. So
if I look at this one, you can say to include prior year if you want. I won't check that, but if I look at this by default, it'll look like that, where you see dollars sold, cost of goods sold, gross profit amount by customer, by period, and then here's your year-to-date amounts here.
And then there'll be a total for the report at the end.
At the bottom, you have a report total.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's other history reports out there too. That's just one I brought up off top of my head. I was thinking that might kind of help with what they were asking.
All right. Yep. Thank you, Chris. All right. Looks like that's about it.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess, thanks to everybody for attending, taking the time out to kind of, watch through the webinar here. If you have any follow-up questions or anything, just reach out to your contact here at Sage, and we can follow up accordingly.
Yeah. Or Martin Associates.
I don't know why I said Sage. Sorry about that.
It's a company line.
Yeah. Follow up with your appropriate Martin Associates contact, and we'll be able to help you accordingly with your Sage. Great. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Joe, for going over all that. Thanks for everybody attending. Like I said, you'll be getting an email with the link to the recording, and we'll go from there. Have a good rest of your week, and happy holidays to everybody. We'll go talk to you later. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yep.